When someone is going through a storm, your silent presence is more powerful than a million empty words. This is Silent Presence with Rich Patricia. It's a show about caring, a moment for understanding, a time to think about those around you. In a time of increased stress and uncertainty, your silent presence is more powerful than a million empty words. And now, the host of Silent Presence, Rich Patricia.
Hi everyone, and welcome to Silent Presence. Before I begin, I'd like to personally thank all of you for coming back and listening to my show every week. Over the past month, I've received many letters from listeners around the country thanking me for doing this show. I just can't tell you how grateful and how lucky I am to have you all listening. So thank you from the bottom of my heart for joining me every week. Speaking of shows, today I'm lucky enough to have a former TV anchor, podcast host, author, and public speaker. He'll talk about his upbringing and complicated past, his tragic loss, family struggles, and how he remained optimistic in a pessimistic world. Ladies and gentlemen, Larry Camp. Larry, welcome to the show.
Hey, glad to be here.
And listen, you are a published author, a public speaker, and a podcaster yourself, and you've been through quite a bit in your life leading up to some of the things that you discuss in your podcast and as a public speaker. You talk about remaining optimistic in a world that can be sometimes so pessimistic, and that's one of the topics that I'd like to talk to you about today. And there's also another thing that we're going to get into, and that's something that you and I both have in common. But before I do that, why don't we hear a little bit about your life?
So, let me just say that at about the age of 14, I got my first real girlfriend, and it happened at a time when I was really getting into music even more. In the Mormon church, they would have these weekly dances, and I lived in San Diego, California at the time, and so the Mormon congregations are called wards, and then the wards are within a stake. So if you have a stake, it might have 8 or 10 wards in its boundaries. So they would have what they call these stake dances on Saturday nights, and they were for 14 to 18-year-olds. And so at 14, I would start going to these dances, and back then they had live bands that played. And so I loved just going and really watching the drummer, particularly because I was playing drums at the time. And I was so shy that when occasionally a girl would ask me to dance, and I would tell them no, because I didn't know how to dance. And I felt like everybody would be watching me, making fun of me. But I started liking this girl at that time, and she would go to my church, the ward that I was in, even though we went to different schools, because there weren't a lot of Mormons in Southern California back in the late 60s, early 70s. And as a matter of fact, there was 4 in my entire school, wow. And one of them was my sister. So, having a girl that you like, you kind of want to dance. And so I actually asked my older sister, 15 months older than me, to show me a few moves. And the next week I went out to the dance and did a couple of dances and with her, and it really was a kind of a changing moment in my life where I started to gain some confidence, maybe not be as shy as I was. Of course, I was still too shy to kiss her, but that came in time. And as a matter of fact, she kissed me first. I think she got tired of waiting for me. But so I've always had an appreciation of girls, and it's always been a big part of my life. And when I would get a girlfriend, I would go with them a long time. I had 3 or 4 that I went with for over a year, growing up. So I even though I dated some, if I saw somebody I liked, I really stuck with them. And I think that had a big influence on my life too, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But at the age of 18, my family took our first trip to Hawaii. And Hawaii was something I just was enamored with since I was like 5 or 6 years old. I'm not even sure why, but when I used to watch Let's Make a Deal with Monty Hall, when I was over at my grandma's house, a lot of times they'd say, "Hey, you've won a trip to Hawaii." And I'd look at my grandma and I'd say, "I'm going to live there someday." And she'd just pat my head and say, "Oh, that's nice."
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah, but like I say, I always wanted to go, but, people didn't fly much back in the 60s and the 70s. And so for us to go to Hawaii, my dad, like I said, we had 6 kids, and, he wanted to take the grandparents. And so he ended up putting a trip together when I was 18 years old and took everybody over to Hawaii, and we stayed a month. It was unbelievable. And the door opening on the airplane when we landed on Oahu, and you felt that warm, kind of humid air. And I just turned to my cousin and I said, "I'm living here someday." And he's like, "Yeah, right. Let's go. Come on." So it was just a great experience. So everything I'd ever imagined it would be, and probably more. But right after that, at the age of 19, I was asked to go on a Mormon mission. And if you've ever seen the missionaries, they're the ones wearing the white shirts and the black name tags, and they ride bikes around. Well, that's what I did. And you don't get to pick where you go. You go for 2 years. It's your own dime, so they don't pay you to do it. Usually your parents encourage you to start saving money when you're a young boy, to save up for your mission. And so, yeah, I went to Arizona and New Mexico, which was kind of a disappointment, but you don't get to pick. My younger brother went to England, my sister went to Italy, and I went to Arizona. So, that's the way it works out sometimes. But so I did that for 2 years, from age 19 to 21. And the other thing that I'll say is that I had a girlfriend during that time. And so we would write letters back and forth every week. Sometimes she would send me a cassette tape, but very much felt like I was in love and like she was the one for me. So when I returned home from my mission, we were married in 4 months.
Wow.
Because in the Mormon religion, they will say that sex outside of marriage is second only to murder when it comes to sin. So they really put a big emphasis on not having sex. But if you're 21, you love somebody, and you want to get married in the Mormon temple, because that's the other part that, all the girls want to marry a returned missionary, and you're supposed to be married in the temple. It all kind of just falls in line. And then if you wait too long, 6 months or 8 months, heaven forbid, who knows? You could be tempted and have sex, and then you're in trouble. So, So that's what happened there. So there you go. That's 0 to 21 fairly quickly. But the things that influenced my life would be that 2-year mission where I was literally knocking on people's doors, just cold calling them, if you will, because if you think about it, it's 2 years of sales. I'm selling a religion rather than maybe a product, but I was good at it. That when I say I'm good at it, I was able to convert a lot more people than anybody else in my particular mission at that time. And so naturally, you take those same skills that you develop, public speaking, being assertive, you take those into the business world or whatever, you're going to be successful. So I returned home, like I say, got married right away. Went to Brigham Young University, got my degree in broadcast communications, got that first job in New Mexico at KFAI Channel 12. I wasn't really cut out to just, sit behind a desk and tell the scores. That's not what I really wanted to do. So 6-8 months of that, I had an opportunity to go into business. If you recall back, well, even still, Jiffy Lubes, which is a quick oil change facility.
Mm-hmm.
I started with that organization basically in 1983, and I was there for 22 years, kind of rose up through the ranks, became a vice president over operations of the West Coast company stores. So I had about 120 stores. So I was there, like I say, 22 years. During that period of time, we had our first child, Crosby, right before we moved out of Utah, actually. And then my son, Dusty, was born in Las Vegas, Nevada, when I was there running stores there. And then we ended up moving to Arizona, and our daughter, Tatum, was born there. So 3 children born in 3 different states. I think that happens in the corporate world a lot of times if you're in operations because you get moved around.
There were things during that period of time growing up in your religion that wasn't so great. Did that play a role in your life as to the way that you handle things now and speak about?
Well, absolutely. I mean, one thing that in the religion I was brought up in is that we were told that it was the only true religion, not unlike I'm sure others who grew up, whatever their religion is, quite often your religion is the true one.
Right.
And that's what we were taught. So we were also taught that it didn't change, that it was, the same, yesterday and today, and it'd be the same tomorrow. Well, then as you start to get older, and we had what is called the priesthood, and when a young man turns the age of 12, he's given the priesthood. And there's a couple of branches of that. There's the Aaronic priesthood for young men up through the age of 18, and then you're given the Melchizedek priesthood at 18 that you have as an adult. But as I was getting ready to go on my Mormon mission, hands were laid on my head, and I was giving a blessing. And in that blessing, I was told that my family would be protected. And that gave me a lot of peace, because when you leave on a Mormon mission, you have no contact or see your family for 2 years. You're able to call home twice a year, once at Christmas and once on Mother's Day. And that's it. Other than letters, you don't see or hear from anybody. So to know that they were going to be protected, that meant a lot to me. But when I was out about 1 year, I was tracked down because, this is long before cell phones or anything like that. And I got a message that I was to call home. And so I did. And my younger brother, Jeff, who was 16 years old, had broken his neck on a trampoline, and they weren't sure if he was going to live or not. It was just a traumatic thing. He ended up living, but was rendered a quadriplegic for the rest of his life.
Oh my.
But the thing that affected me the most was I recalled back instantly to that blessing that I received. And I thought, whoa. hey, man, I was told my family be protected while I'm out here serving the Lord, and I really had an issue with that. And so if you can imagine a shelf, the problems that I had, I just kind of stuck them up on that shelf. And over the years, as things would happen in my life, I would just put them on the shelf. And I kind of skipped over one of them. Remember, I told you I got married 4 months after I got home from my mission?
Yes.
18 months later, my wife wanted to get a divorce.
Oh, boy.
And in the Mormon church, one of the biggest things is when you're married to the temple, it says you are married for time and all eternity. So it's not like till death do us part, because we believe that after we die, when I say we, the Mormons, believe that after you die, you are then judged according to how you've lived your life, and you were assigned where you're going to go. But you have the chance to live as a family and with your wife forever, eternity. So, yeah, I guess 18 months was enough for her when it comes to eternity. But so that was traumatic, because we're told, at least I was when I was brought up, that, there's kind of one person for you, and they're out there and they're living their life. They're not having sex. They're behaving. So you need to do the same. You don't want to be a chewed piece of gum. They were all these examples they would give us, Yeah, I was just devastated, because I'd known this girl for 7 years, even though we got married 4 months after I got home. I met her when I was 14 years old. So
Right.
I really felt like she was the one for me. And man, it was traumatic. So boom, that went up on my shelf also. So, I'm starting to get a kind of a shelf with a little bow in it as I'm starting to get it weighed down. But I met my wife, Judy, that much later, and we got married, and we've been married 39 years now. So everything's good. Very happy there. But shortly after I got married to Judy, my parents got divorced.
Oh, boy.
And they've been married 28 years, so had 6 kids. And I remember asking my dad, who'd always been my example in my life, what about this families are for everything and eternal marriage to mom? Well, that's kind of a gray area. Seeing my parents go through a divorce, again, kind of weighed my shelf down. And so I started having some questions about my upbringing. When I say upbringing, I mean my belief in the church, in the Mormon faith. They had long had an issue with African Americans or blacks having the priesthood. They prohibited from that until 1978. I had a struggle with that. They've, even to this day, they don't accept the LGBTQ lifestyle. You can be a member, but see, you can't act upon it. So, for example, I have a sister that is gay. She's been married to another woman now for many years. As a matter of fact, they've been together for 24 years. But they cannot be members of the Mormon church in good standing, because they are living as a couple, and you can't do that. So I had a real problem with that, obviously. So these all started to weigh my shelf down. And so my daughter, who went to BYU Hawaii, they have a small campus over in Hawaii, she came home during the Christmas of 2016 and 17 and said, hey, I want to talk to you guys. And when she was home for that Christmas break, and she said, have you heard about the essays the church put out in 2013? And we said, no. She goes, well, yeah, you might want to read those, because I have, and I studied about them, and I no longer believe the church is true. That's kind of a big deal to have one of your kids come forward and tell you that. And so she went back off to school. I said, well, if you believe that, you better keep that to yourself, because you don't want the school to boot you out. You got to be a believing member if you're going to go there. And she was almost ready to graduate. So she just kind of stayed under the radar on that. But I started to do some research, as did my wife, and we very quickly came to the conclusion, my daughter was right, that the information we were told growing up, the church had changed their position on a few things. They'd withheld some information on a few things. And people say, what's the thing that took you out of the Mormon church? I go, Google, because now you have the access, the ability to look things up. You don't have to take things as gospel that somebody tells you. So we were able to look some up, do some research, and, came up with our own conclusion that the church wasn't true. And so we left officially, where we had our names removed from the records and everything, in 2017. We left maybe a little before that, but we wanted it to be official. We didn't want to have anything to do with it. About a year after we officially left the church, we had decided to move, because it was difficult to live in the area we had been for 25 years, where everybody knew us as Mormons. I would say probably for my wife, 90% of her friend base was Mormon. And once you leave, it's very uncomfortable for practicing Mormons to associate with someone who's left. As a matter of fact, they're encouraged not to, because you're a Cancer. You're going to influence them and maybe get them to start thinking about, things they shouldn't be thinking about, and so forth. So all of a sudden, she's had a lot of friends, but they just kind of slowly went away. And so she started bringing up to me, hey, maybe we need to move. And I think it might just be time to get to some place where we can start over, where nobody knows us as Mormons and so forth. So So we had just sold our house, just purchased a house in southern Utah. I know that might sound funny to people, like, you went to Utah? Isn't that where all the Mormons are? Well, we're in St. George, Utah. I'm looking out my window, and there is a couple of Mormons on our street, but there's no Mormons in my end of the cul-de-sac here. There's a lot of people moving here because of the weather, the cost of living and so forth. And we're an hour and 45 minutes from Las Vegas. We're only, 15 minutes from Arizona, where I live right here. So very, very far southwest Utah. But we had just purchased a house here, and we're just kind of in that phase of packing up and that kind of stuff that goes on for a couple of weeks before you make your actual move. And as I mentioned earlier, I play a lot of softball, and I play on a couple of traveling teams. I play on one team out of Hawaii. I kind of passed over it, but we actually moved to Hawaii and lived there for a couple of years, from 2014 to 16. And we had purchased a condo in Maui in 2002. So we actually had a condo for 14 years and would go quite often and stay there. So I did accomplish that goal of moving to Hawaii that I always wanted to, and really loved it. But I kind of fell in with a bunch of guys that played softball over there, and I still play with them on a traveling team. And so we play in Las Vegas each year. So in September of 2018, I had gone to the softball tournament in Las Vegas. My wife, Judy, had traveled over to Oahu in Hawaii because our daughter had gotten married to a young man, Jack. He was in the Coast Guard, and so they were having our first grandbaby. And so she went over there to be there for the birth of this grandchild. While I was in Las Vegas, I got a phone call that my son had been taken to the hospital experiencing some stomach pain. This was on a Thursday afternoon. So, I called and got the details, and he was on his way home. He had been there for a number of hours, but they couldn't really find anything wrong with him, and they sent him home. So that was a very big relief. I was concerned because, it was bad enough that they had airlifted him into the hospital. He's a surveyor, and he was in the far west valley of Phoenix, Arizona, and they'd flown him into the hospital because he was in so much pain. But after about 6 hours, like I said, they sent him home and hey, monitor things and whatnot. So.
And how old was he at the time?
He was 31 years old, and he had just gotten married the year before. So his wife, she met him at the hospital, and she drove him home. And the next day, I am playing ball again. It's about 6 p.m, early evening, and we just finished a game, and I noticed I'd missed a call from my daughter-in-law. So I called her back, and when she answered the phone, she was out of breath, and she's like, "Hey, they just rushed Dusty to the hospital again. He passed out, and I gave him CPR, and so my parents are coming to get me, and they're taking me to the hospital." I said, "Okay, all right, I'll go to the hotel. I'll start to change. Let me know what's going on." Okay. So I rushed, or I told my teammates, "Hey guys, I don't know what's going on here. My son's been rushed to the hospital. I'm heading back to the hotel, but I might be going home." I had driven to Las Vegas. It's about a 5.5-hour drive from Phoenix, which is where we were living. I got to the hotel. I jumped in the shower real quick, got out, and I was packing my bag, and my phone rang. And when I answered the phone, it wasn't my daughter-in-law. It was my wife. She didn't say anything, but the wailing that I heard, I knew right then that my son had passed away. And so it happened very quickly. From the time that he actually collapsed, he grabbed his stomach and collapsed, to the time he passed away was just over an hour. So just devastated. This was our son, Dusty, who was born in Las Vegas, as I went through things sequentially. The one thing I didn't mention was that my older son, Crosby, was a tremendous athlete, all-conference baseball player, had multiple offers to play Division I college baseball, but he got into drugs as a 18-year-old and just battled them for years and years. He would go through some rehabs and do well for a couple of years. And when I say do well, he would do well if he got onto methadone or something that would keep him off of heroin. But at the time, he had kind of fallen into, I guess, just a cycle of living where he'd withdrawn from all of his friends. He wasn't really working much, and he was living with us as long as he was not using drugs and was not doing anything illegal. So at that time, he was living with us. So this is my oldest son, Crosby. His only real friend was his brother, Dusty.
Oh, boy. So
when my wife called me and told me that Dusty had passed, we just spoke briefly, and I said, "Hey, I'm going to head home then. I'll start driving here after I get packed up. But before I go, I'm going to call Crosby. I don't want him to hear this from anybody, except me." So I called my son Crosby, who was at home, and I'll never forget his reaction as he just went out of control. And I said, "Crosby, look, I'll be home about 2:30 in the morning. Promise me you won't go anywhere. You won't do anything. Just stay there until I get home. And he said he would. And so I started my driving home. Like you say, we share this. I don't know your story, but my story is just one of unbelievable sadness for the loss of my son and what that means to my wife and I and our family, but also for the loss for his wife. He'd only been married 15 months, I believe, at the time that he passed. They didn't have any children. She wasn't pregnant or anything like that, but they had just bought a condo not even 90 days earlier. They had just bought their first place. He just had his whole life ahead of him. So just the loss of that potential was just overwhelming and discouraging. And I made that drive home. I met with Crosby. We hugged. I was just so mentally and physically drained by the time I got home that we just said, hey, let's just go to bed and we'll talk in the morning. And the reason I bring up Crosby's part of this, I just felt it was important because Crosby couldn't handle it. And within probably days, because I didn't know all this until later, of course, he started using again. And to just numb himself to the fact that he lost his brother. He just said, my life is a piece of shit. Why did God take Dusty and not me?
Yeah.
Dusty had so much going for him and I got nothing. And he just couldn't believe that, and
well, because kids and people who are addicted feel very badly about themselves and they don't think that they're really worth living in a lot of ways. And that's one of the things that my son would always say too. He would say the same sort of things. I'm not worth it. I'm a piece of garbage. And it's very similar.
It is. And, we love our children and you don't love, one more than the other. And, there was a saying one time that you're only as happy as your most unhappy child. And there's some truth to that because even though Crosby would have times where he might be doing well and he was able to hold a job down for a couple of years and, you're happy for his successes, then you'd see him fail again. And then how much it disappoints us, sure, but it also makes him feel so terrible because he would tell us, I love you guys and it just tears me apart that I'm disappointed you once again. So that's where he was, and this just devastated him. Judy, of course, being in Hawaii, our daughter had the baby on the 16th of September. This happened on the 21st of September. So the baby was 5 days old and wasn't even released from the hospital yet because she had a little bit of an infection when she was born. But Judy just knew that she had to get on the plane and come home. Unfortunately, my daughter, having just had the baby, she couldn't come home. We had a celebration of life about a week later for Dusty, and Tatum, our daughter, could not attend that. It was taped and sent to her. She was able to hear the celebration but not be there. Judy and I, we had a lot of friends there. This was just weeks before we were making our move to southern Utah. And I will say this, the friends that kind of ran away once we left the church really rallied around us when Dusty passed. Many of them had taught Dusty as a young boy in church, in their Sunday school classes and in scouting, and coached him in the Little League and in football and different things that he did. So they knew Dusty also. So when we had this celebration of life, it was not a religious event because, to be quite frank, once we left the Mormon church, we really have not affiliated with any religion whatsoever. So we just had this celebration where we had family members just kind of come up and speak and recall some times with Dusty and some stories about Dusty, and we showed some videos and pictures and things. And it was a nice celebration, but it's hard to really call it a celebration of life when the life has only been 31 years.
It's very difficult. In my case, my son was 20. He had just come out of rehab after 7.5 months. He was home for about a month and a half, and we found him. It's very, very difficult to describe the feelings and emotions involved in it. It's one of the reasons why I'm doing this, and I'm sure one of the reasons why you want to do podcasting and public speaking as well, and that is to talk about some of the things that bother you or that you've dealt with in your life.
I talk a little bit about his issues in my book. The book was completed before he went to prison. I did just do a revision of my book that just came out last month because I added a chapter on losing a child where I spoke quite a bit about Dusty and about what that's like as a parent for that to happen. And then I made some other updates because my book is really, it's a memoir, but it's also just kind of my take on life. You can adapt to it. I mean, when you do a print on demand, you just pay a fee and you go in there and revise or add to or whatever. So I may do it again in a couple of years again if I've had some things happen that I want to update. So that's just been done. I felt like it was important to add that chapter. Kind of like you said, doing your podcast, these are ways to give us an opportunity to talk about our children and, kind of honor them. And so, and I'll talk about that a little bit here in a minute too, but let me just pick up where I kind of left off about Dusty's celebration of life that happened. We ended up moving literally 3 weeks later. We picked up and moved to southern Utah. We've had contact, of course, with 2 or 3 couples that we're really good, close friends with, and they've maintained that friendship even though we've left the church and they are still in. We have enough in common outside of the church that we can still find things to do and fun hikes to take and things like that. So, but when we moved to Utah, Crosby, my older son, came with us, and with the understanding that, he needs to remain drug-free, he needs to be law-abiding, and if he does that and he gets a job and so forth, then he's welcome to live with us. That lasted about 2 weeks, and we discovered that he had been using heroin again, and so we said, son, we love you, but you know the rules. There's not a lot of opportunity in St. George, Utah for people who are homeless or people that are addicted and need some assistance. It's just, even though it's different now than it was 20 years ago, it's probably still 75% Mormon. And when you have that kind of a religious influence, there's not a lot of assistance and help available, at least not in this community. So the one place there was, we had a friend that worked there that we had known in Arizona. And so she was able to get him in there, and you can stay for 30 nights. So it was nice just to know he had a roof over his head and so forth. But shortly after this incident, where he was out on his own, we got a phone call in the morning, and it was from this gal that worked in that recovery place. And she said, hey, sorry about Crosby. I'm sorry, and we're like, what? We hadn't heard anything. He didn't come home last night. Or, he's gone, but what are you talking about? She goes, oh, well, yeah, I get the jail reports each morning and I can see he's in jail. So what had happened was he had been caught basically using somebody's credit card, and so had been arrested, put in jail. And long story short, when they tried to arrest him, he took off.
Right.
So it wasn't just using the credit card now it was evading the police. So he had extra charges, and it wasn't his first brush with the law. So he ended up getting sentenced to 2.5 years in prison, and that's where he is right now. He's still got at least another year to go. I guess if there's any silver lining in his experience or what has happened to him, is that he's now 14 months drug-free. I mean, yes, I'm not an idiot. I know you can get drugs in prison, but we've been visiting him each month. He's about 3.5 hours away from us, and so we'll drive and visit with him for 2 hours. And for the first time in years, he's clear-headed. He's the Crosby that we used to know. He's incredibly intelligent. It's just great to be able to visit with him and kind of see the guy that we used to know that had all the potential. So we have very good hopes for him. But, I think we also know the reality of people who have battled drugs for 15 years. So there's no guarantees.
There are no guarantees. It's an amazing feeling. When I went to go pick up my son from the airport when he was out of rehab, I drove around the airport 3 times. It took me an hour and a half to be able to identify him because he had changed so much. He put on some weight, looked great, was clear-headed, and like you said, it was almost like, wow, I've got my son back. I've got that person who I haven't seen, who I haven't spoken to and been able to communicate with for years and years and years, and he's back. And I could see how your experience could have been like that as well. Probably looks and acts much better now being in the environment that he is.
Oh, absolutely. And he got accepted into a program within the prison. It's called the HOPE program, and HOPE is an acronym for Helping Offenders Parole Effectively. And you have to be in that for 12 months, and then you get graduation certificate, but they also take 4 months off of your sentence for that. Of course, we want him to parole effectively. We want him to get out. He is going to be 38 years old by the time he gets out. So we, of course, want him to move on with his life, to have a life that's not centered around trying to get your latest score and get high, and that becomes your life. So we want him to be able to. He also was accepted into a culinary program, and he's actually loving it, and is receiving college credit for that. So now he'll be able to have some sort of a job to go to also. So for Crosby, things are looking up. The one thing that I would say is still very touchy for him, in the year plus that he's been incarcerated, we haven't been able to talk about Dusty one time because he won't talk about Dusty. He said he can't do it without becoming emotional, and he doesn't want to be emotional around other prisoners. So he just started seeing a therapist. You had to be in there for 8 or maybe 9 months before they would allow you to see a therapist there. So he's just started that, and I think that will do him some good. So that's what's going on with him. But yeah, that certainly shaped and it affected our life as we had a child addicted to drugs for really going on close to 20 years now.
What was Dusty like?
Dusty was a great kid. I think, when you're the second child, and certainly you have a brother who's very accomplished like Crosby was. Crosby was an incredible musician. He could play the guitar like crazy. He was an unbelievable athlete, never hit below 400, if you know anything about baseball, all the way through high school. Crosby was big for his age. When he was 14, he was already 5'11", 190 pounds. So Dusty was small. Dusty was 9 pounds, 12 ounces when he was born, but then he got RSV. Mm-hmm. And if you know what RSV is, it's a respiratory virus. Mm-hmm. And when he was only an infant when that happened, 6 weeks old. And I really believe that it kind of impacted him. He always had lung issues as a child. If he went and slept over at somebody's house and they had a fan blowing, believe it or not, he would get sick. People thought it was all in our heads until they experienced it themselves. But the doctor said he would outgrow that, and he did. But whether that shaped or hindered his growth, I don't know. He ended up being about 5'8". But yeah, he loved sports. He was a huge sports fan. He played basketball in his youth, football in Pop Warner. He played baseball all the way up into high school. He just bounced around for a little bit, and he ended up joining the Air Force and spent 4 years in the Air Force. He was stationed in Italy at Aviano Air Force Base in Italy. He was spent some time in California. He just wasn't really sure what he wanted to do, but at about the age of 28, 27, 28, he got a job with a guy that had a survey company, and it just was a good match. They got along pretty well. Guy kind of ran his own business, and Dusty, that's what he was doing when he passed away. He was working as a surveyor. But he loved music. I think partly because of Crosby, he decided he wanted to play the guitar and had a few lessons early on, but then pretty much just self-taught. He would just get on the computer and just watch videos and just take off and go. And another one of his big loves was astronomy. Wow. He would love to look up into the sky, and he could tell you what, hey, that's whatever you're looking at. So that was a big thing. We have his telescope here, and I was just telling my wife that this would be the time of year now. Let's get that thing out. And with the coronavirus going on and nobody driving, the skies are so clear right now. I said, let's get out that telescope and check out the sky, the night sky.
They're saying the ozone layer never looked better.
Exactly.
Let's change gears a little bit, if you don't mind. Let's talk about your view on life and some of the things that you're doing for your life.
I think that everybody's going to go through tragedies in their life. Nobody escapes them. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter what your income level is. You are going to have things happen that you would rather not have happen. And you have a choice you can make. You can let that affect you in a positive or a negative way. Sometimes it's going to be a negative, but you can still make it a positive. And a lot of that is your outlook. Now, I will say this. I've always been an optimistic person. I've always been a glass half full. It's my personality. I've never dealt with depression. So right there, I think I have a little bit of an advantage over maybe others. But when Dusty passed away, for example, to this day, if I look at certain pictures, I will well up and I'll have tears and things. I'm not sure that'll ever go away. And it's been over a year and a half now. But I'm okay with that. I really want people to know about my son. On the 1 month anniversary of his passing, I got a tattoo on my wrist. And when my friend Matt was doing the tattoo, he had it facing me. I go, no, turn it around. I want Dusty to point outwards so that if somebody sees my hand, they can read it, because I want them to then say, oh, Dusty, what's that? And then I get a chance to talk about my son. So that was therapeutic, I think, for me. I see it every day. And when I see it, I just kind of out loud talk to him a little bit. Another thing that I did that was therapeutic for me was I put together a book of over 900 pictures, and that took me a couple of months to do that. I sent emails to family and friends. Hey, send me any pictures you might have of Dusty. I want to put them in this book. And then I gave copies of that book to Tatum and to Crosby and to his grandmother, who's still alive. And then we have, of course, copies here. Yeah. And every once in a while, as recently as yesterday, I will just kind of get it out and look at it. I may go a couple of weeks and not look at it, but I'll get it out and look at it sometimes. And to me, it just helps me remember. And, the great memories that we have, because most of those pictures, I was a part of a lot of them, and they're family vacations or Little League games or whatever. So those were fun things. But I think that if you can do some of those things, that can help you remember the passing of your loved one in a positive way. Another thing we did, because Dusty loved Hawaii so much, our children got to go to Hawaii every 2 years from the time they were born, because at that time we had a big home on Oahu that we had a timeshare in. This was before we bought our condo. And so there was one beach over there on Oahu that my kids just loved, riding boogie boards and whatnot. So when it came time to spread Dusty's ashes, we knew that's the place that we wanted to take him. So we took Elizabeth, his wife, all of us, we went over there. Remember, Tatum wasn't able to attend his celebration of life. So this gave her an opportunity to be a part of this kind of experience of spreading Dusty's ashes. And so we all did that together. We turned that into a positive experience. And so I think for me, as an optimistic, as a positive person, I have different ways that I can experience joy. It brings me joy talking about my son, about my granddaughter. I continue to do the things that I enjoy that bring me happiness, and that is playing softball. I actually went out this morning, and even though we're in this social distancing time right now, we can play softball. There's 3 of us. One guy's out in the outfield, one guy's pitching 50 feet away, and one guy's hitting, and then we just switch spots, and we're never within 10 feet of each other, but yet we can do that. We do that a couple of days a week.
That's great.
We can still go on hikes. We just, of course, things like right now, traveling to Hawaii or maybe playing poker with your friends, those things have kind of are on hold. But yeah, I think that you need to develop, if you don't have some hobbies or something, you need to do some of those things. And of course, public speaking is something that, again, gives me an opportunity to reflect upon my son and tell about him, and maybe help others that haven't had an easy a go as I have of dealing with the loss of a child or maybe even a spouse or something like that. But I should mention, too, that my brother Jeff, remember the one that broke his neck while I was on my mission?
Yes.
He ended up getting cancer and dying when he was 28 years old, and he never was able to really experience and have much of a life. So, I've experienced a divorce myself, the divorce of my parents, the loss of a brother, the loss of a child. So I feel like those are all kind of traumatic events if you allow them to be. But I do think that there's still a lot of positives in the world. I know that if you watch the news, sometimes that's hard to imagine that. But, the good stories, they're not newsworthy. That's not what sells, So I understand that. I just hope others do too.
Well, in a time like right now, too, dealing with what we're dealing with, what can you recommend to people that might be dealing with or living with some form of grief or going through certain emotions at this time?
Well, I would say, depending on what the grief is, it revolves around. If it's around the loss of a loved one or a child or a spouse or something like that, I think just to remembering the good times. And the way I did that, like I say, is through a book, or maybe you have some old films or some DVDs of when the kids were little and you just want to sit down and watch those and just remember the good times. And if you're a religious person and you believe that there's something beyond this life, then you look forward to that day when you'll be reunited. I'll be honest with you, I don't know about that. And the title of my book is so funny because I started writing that book when I was still a believing Mormon. I started writing that book in 2011, and my title was Nobody Knows. They just want you to think they do. Most of that's because I'm just a cynical, snarky guy sometimes.
Right.
That's part of my sense of humor. But wow, it's really true in so many cases. I mean, I don't care who you talk to, whether it's the Pope or whether it's the prophet of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints or whoever, nobody knows. They might tell you they know, but they don't know. They just believe. And there's a difference. There's a difference. And so I hope, and that's what I'll say, I hope there's something beyond this life. I hope I'll be reunited with my son, Dusty, with both my parents who have passed, my brother Jeff who has passed, my grandparents. It'd be wonderful to see these folks again. And of course, I'd love to see and spend time with Judy after this life. But I don't know that. I just have to say it's a hope I have. And I think sometimes, back to your question, Rich, when you said what will bring people joy right now, sometimes it's just the hope of a better tomorrow,
That's something that everybody can hope for and bring some positivity. Your wife had said, why should anyone care what you think about your book? I thought that was really kind of funny. How does she feel now?
You know what? She still hasn't even read my book. And she's read the chapter on my son, of course, and she's read a chapter that I wrote on fathers because it talks quite a bit about her dad. So she's read parts of it, but she just says, I'm just too close. I'll see things differently than anybody else. And she keeps me grounded, that's for sure. I think sometimes I just got lucky. I mean, you think you really know somebody when you get married. I mean, we dated in Mormon terms a long time, which was almost a year. But yeah, and we were old for Mormons too. I mean, I was 24 years old when I got married to Judy. That's pretty old for a Mormon guy, at least, 40 years ago. And you just work at it continually. I mean, you don't get to a place in life where you think, hey, I've been married 20 years, so I can coast now. That's not a good thing. You want to keep working at it all the time. If you look at your career, you look at, there's part in my book where I talk about wanting to master something. It's called Jack of all frickin' trades. And what it is I can do a lot of things, but I could do very few things well. And if you ask me, are you proficient at anything? I would say not really, because to be proficient, you have to put in 10,000 hours at playing the guitar or at doing art or whatever it is that you want to really become proficient at. And most people, they get excited about something, they start it, maybe they'll do it for a little while, and then it gets kind of hard and they kind of, they're done with that. That's how a lot of people are. So, I mean, you just got to keep plugging away and working at things if you want to excel and to be good at them. And so right now, the thing and picking up podcasting, we talked about this earlier, this is something I'm doing as a hobby, and it's something I enjoy. I enjoy talking with the person that I'm interviewing and learning about their life and what makes them tick. And I always find some similarities in everybody I talk with. We're not that different. Sometimes we think we're very different. I grew up in California, this guy grew up in New Jersey, or this guy grew up in England, but we're not that different when it comes down to it. We just had different experiences.
Everybody has something. Everybody has something going on. We hear that all the time. It's just so important to be kind to one another and just understand that each person out there has something going on in their lives, and we don't know what it is. And by looking at you and listening to you in the second half of this show, I would have never known that you had so many things that went on in your life, because you are so positive. And I think that's a great thing. And I think it's important to continue to be positive. And you're right. We're still going to cry. We're still going to have those moments in our lives that are going to bring us down. But in the end, smiling is important because you get a smile back. Being happy is important because you get happiness back, And I think that's a way of fulfilling our own personal feelings too sometimes. But I'm not going to walk around with a puss on my face all day long and bring other people down. I'd much rather walk around with a smile on my face and have people look back at me and smile. That makes me feel better.
Well, absolutely. And like you said, you don't know what other people are going through. And sometimes you're interacting with them with a smile on your face might be the only time in the day that they've had somebody show some positivity towards them. So yeah, I mean, it's tough at times with what we have to deal with in life. I mean, you look at the people who have lost their jobs. I mean, 1 out of 10 people have lost their jobs here in the last 4 or 5 weeks. And there's a lot to be concerned about in our country right now. But again, I'd still try to focus on the positive where we can find it, because I think we need to do that. And it's like I told my wife when we're watching the news, man, they keep talking about all this and the death toll and this and that. I said, my favorite part of the news is when they have some positive stories to go like, hey, we're making some strides in making some steps towards a vaccine or towards this or that. To me, that's the kind of stuff I want to hear. And I think that helps people that when they're sitting at home and they're not being able to associate with their friends, because most of us like to do some interaction with other people. And when you're home all day and all you're looking at is each other or the four walls, that gets old after a few weeks.
It does. And, one of the things that I don't watch the news. I can't watch the news anymore. It's the same old thing. I like to be informed, but then again, I don't know what I'm being informed with, so I try to read a little bit and everything, but watching the news can really bring people down. And personally, just from my point of view, I don't think it's very healthy to continue to watch the news, especially if you are living with sadness or depression. It's not a good place to be.
No, that's true. And you know what? This is a good time to get into podcasts, listening to podcasts. You can catch up on books you wanted to read for a while. So there are some things that are coming out of this, just the time to maybe do some projects that you put off. And that's kind of what, as I talk to my siblings or whoever, that's the kind of stuff that we're sharing. You're able to do some, Zoom calls with, or Skype with, we can Skype with my granddaughter, and we try and do that almost every day. And it just brings us 5 or 10 minutes of joy. And that's what you need in your life. You need a little bit of joy. And like I said earlier, it's out there. Sometimes you might have to look for it a little bit. My wife and I are both pretty positive people. So, we enjoy each other's company, and we're not tired of each other yet.
That's great. Your website is Nobody Knows Larry Camp. Hopefully they know a lot more about you now than they did before. And hopefully with your podcast, Nobody Knows Your Story, people will get to know you a lot more.
Yeah, nobodyknowslarrycamp.com. And I'm going to have, and I'm not sure if you've done this yet or not, but I'm just in the process right now of putting a plug-in on there so that people can go to my website and hear those podcasts right from my website too. So I should have that done hopefully either later today or certainly by Monday. So,
well, that's fantastic. I look forward to listening to it as well.
Right on, Rich. Well, hey, listen, I appreciate giving me the opportunity here to be on your podcast, and keep me posted. And I'll certainly publicize your podcast on my show, and certainly amongst my friends and family as well.
That sounds great. Thank you so much, Larry.
Okay, Rich. Take care, buddy.
Take care. Today's guest has been Larry Camp, author of Nobody Knows. They Just Want You to Think They Do. For more information about Larry, his book, or to listen to his podcast, Nobody Knows Your Story, you can visit his website at nobodyknowslarrycamp.com.
Thanks for listening to Silent Presence. Tune in next week for another amazing guest. And remember, be kind to one another. You may just be the silent presence they need. For more information, visit silentpresencepodcast.com.